I'm glad to introduce our next speaker. David J. Kramer serves as Executive Director of the George W. Bush Institute. Prior to joining the Bush Institute, he taught at Florida's International University School of International and Public Affairs, where he was also a senior fellow in the Václav Havel Program for Human Rights and Diplomacy and Director for European and Eurasian Affairs. Before moving to Miami, Mr. Kramer worked in Washington, D.C. for 24 years, including as Senior Director for Human Rights and Democracy with the McCain Institute for International Leadership, President of Freedom House, and Senior Transatlantic Fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Mr. Kramer served 8 years in the U.S. Department of State during the George W. Bush administration, including as Assistant Secretary of State and Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, responsible for Russia, Ukraine, Moldova, and Belarus affairs, as well as regional nonproliferation issues, professional staff member in the Secretary's Office of Policy Planning, and Senior Advisor to the Undersecretary for Global Affairs. He is author of the book, Back to Containment, Dealing with Putin's Regime, and Mr. Kramer received his MA in Soviet Studies from Harvard University and his BA in Soviet Studies and Political Science from Tufts University. Mr. Kramer, thank you for joining us.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Luke, thanks very much for the introduction. Max and Bambi and everyone involved in this, thank you very much for including me with such distinguished colleagues in this event. And thanks to all of you who are here. Those of you who were forced to come here, since I'm talking about democracy and human rights, come talk to me afterward. That was a violation of your human rights, I think. I am thrilled to be here. And let me just tell you briefly about what the George W. Bush Institute does and who we are. And then I'll launch into the topic about democracy and human rights as a pillar of U.S. foreign policy. The George W. Bush Presidential Center is based in Dallas. It's independent. It's on the campus of Southern Methodist University, and it's made up of three different parts. One is, sorry, this happened to me yesterday, but there's water right here. One is the museum, which covers President Bush's, give me 1 second, I shouldn't have had that granola. One is the museum that we run as part of the center. The other is the library that the National Archives and Records Administration controls. And then there's the Institute, the part that I run, which is focused on policy issues that include domestic issues such as education, immigration, economic growth and democratic capitalism, as well as veterans and military families issues. We have two leadership programs that we run, one with the George H.W. Bush Foundation, Clinton Foundation, and LBJ Foundation called Presidential Leadership Scholars. Another, we focus on veterans. We have an online journal that just came out yesterday with the latest issue on America's 250, the semi-quincentennial as it's called. And then we have work that is focused on global issues that include a focus on global health. I talked about PEPFAR yesterday. It focuses on Afghanistan, Ukraine, China, but also most relevant to this session on democracy and freedom. And this is an issue that is near and dear to the hearts of both President and Mrs. Bush, as well as to all of us who work at the Bush Center. Why do democracy and human rights matter? Why are they a central part of U.S. foreign policy? Think about the democratic peace theory, which says that democracies don't go to war with each other. So the more democracies there are in the world, the more freedom there is in the world, the more peace there will be in the world, the less there will be a need for the defense part of the 3 Ds. So the advance of democracy and freedom, the respect for human rights, is a way to provide for a more secure world. It also provides for a more prosperous world. Democracies tend to thrive more economically, financially. They tend to enrich the people and populations in their countries. Autocracies, authoritarian regimes, tend to engage in corrupt activities that benefit only a small circle of people. Democracies are better allies. In times of need, our democracies come to our aid and support. There has been only one time in the history of NATO, which was founded in 1949, where Article 5, which says that an attack on one NATO ally is considered an attack on one, was invoked. Does anyone know when that was? Shout it out, 9/11. We didn't invoke it, our allies did. And it has never been invoked since. It was never invoked before. But that's a sign of our allies coming to our aid. So having allies on our side is very much to our advantage. Better trade partners, they are more reliable when it comes to a whole range of issues. It's not to say that we don't disagree with allies on occasion. I can think of one occasion. I'm trying to log back in on my computer as I'm stalling for time. There have been occasions where we have disagreed, for example, over Iraq. France and Germany were strongly opposed to the US decision to move into Iraq in 2003. But we don't have a blow up in terms of a kinetic response when it comes to allies. Democracies also tend to emphasize more transparency. Authoritarian regimes are much more corrupt. And there's that nexus between corruption and authoritarianism that's extremely important. The more corrupt a regime becomes, the more authoritarian it's likely to become because it fears having its corruption exposed. If it's exposed, then the people might rise up against that regime. And so there's this vicious circle where regimes engaging in corruption, authoritarian regimes, they are likely to crack down even more to make sure that organizations that focus on transparency don't expose the illicit behavior that they engage in. There's a collection of countries that we focus on at the Bush Institute called CRINC. And this is China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. This is arguably the most threatening axis of powers that we face in the world. What do they have in common? None of them is a democracy. They're all nasty authoritarian regimes that do not mean us well. In fact, a part of their objective is to undermine the sense of legitimacy of democracy. They argue that democracies fail to deliver. China, for example, makes the claim that it has delivered hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And there's truth to that. But the way the Chinese have done it is far different than what a democracy would do. The other part is when you have in Russia, the Putin regime going after critics and opponents, killing Alexei Navalny, Boris Nemtsov, others like that. We shouldn't be surprised that when they don't respect the human rights of Russians, they're not going to respect the human rights of Ukrainians or Georgians or Belarusians. And so we shouldn't be surprised that they invade some of those countries. When the Chinese crack down on dissent in their country, we shouldn't be shocked that they pose a threat to Taiwan, which is an island democracy. The North Korean regime, one of the most repressive in the world, poses a constant threat to the democratic country of South Korea. And Iran, we've seen the horrific crackdown on protesters in Iran. Again, we shouldn't be surprised that Iran is the main sponsor of state terrorism and a threat to Israel, to other countries in the region, and to the United States as well. These regimes do not mean us well, in contrast to democracies that do come together as our fellow NATO allies did in the aftermath of 9/11. There are some who argue, we can either promote values and democracy and human rights, or we can promote our interests. I would argue this is a false choice. This is what the realists argue. Realists say, we've got other interests to worry about. Values are nice. Let's not let them get in the way of our pursuit of other interests. And to be clear, there are economic energy interests with some countries. There are security interests with countries that we have, and we should pursue those interests. But we also have interest in trying to advance democracy and human rights around the world. I view this as a three-legged stool: economic and energy interests, security interests, and democracy and human rights interests. And stools are best if those legs are pretty even. There will be times where economic interests or security interests overshadow democracy and human rights interests. It happens all the time. We do have relations, in some cases very good relations, with countries that don't respect democracy and human rights. That's the reality of the world we live in. But I would argue it is just as important for the United States to pursue that third leg of the stool. Otherwise, the stool becomes unstable and might topple over. The other part I would argue in this beginning is we should stress the importance of universal values rather than American values, rather than Western values. There is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's where we should root our promotion of democracy and human rights. If we talk about American values, then that will alienate quite a few countries around the world. They will say, our unique culture, our unique history, we don't want your values. It's harder to argue against universal values because virtually every country in the world has signed up to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so it's important to focus on universal values rather than American values. In the post-World War II period, we supported countries largely that were anti-communist. There wasn't so much of an emphasis on democracy in the aftermath of World War II. We wanted to make sure that we stopped the advance of communism around the world. We saw what happened in the immediate aftermath, the Soviet Union essentially taking over countries that became Warsaw Pact. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, all of these countries, East Germany, fell under the sway of the Soviet Union in advance of communism. And as a result of this approach, we often didn't focus on democracy and human rights in some countries. As long as they were not communist, we would support them. And this would become a problem over the decades because we were viewed as pursuing double standards, as not something that was consistent with our emphasis on democracy and human rights. Brought us into some controversies. The Iran-Contra controversy under President Reagan. The collapse of the Soviet Union, first the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of 1991, helped change our thinking in terms of support for democracy and human rights because the emphasis on anti-communist movements was not as strong. But it was even before this, in 1982, June 8th, 1982, that President Reagan gave a famous speech at Westminster in the United Kingdom. And it was here that President Reagan spoke about the importance of supporting democracy and human rights around the world. And I'm going to read you just a few short excerpts here. This is, again, President Reagan, June 8th, 1982. He said, "We must be staunch in our conviction that freedom is not the sole prerogative of a lucky few, but the inalienable and universal right of all human beings. The objective I propose is quite simple to state: to foster the infrastructure of democracy, the system of a free press, unions, political parties, universities, which allows a people to choose their own way, to develop their own culture, to reconcile their own differences through peaceful means. It would be cultural condescension," Reagan goes on to say that any people prefer dictatorship to democracy. Who would voluntarily choose not to have the right to vote, to decide to purchase government propaganda handouts instead of independent newspapers, prefer government to work or controlled unions, opt for land to be owned by the state instead of those who till it, want government repression of religious liberty, a single political party instead of free choice, a rigid cultural orthodoxy instead of democratic tolerance or diversity? And Reagan concludes by saying, "Let us now begin a major effort to secure the best, a crusade for freedom that will engage the faith and fortitude of the next generation. For the sake of peace and justice, let us move toward a world in which all people are at last free to determine their own destiny." This speech, a year later, led to the creation of the National Endowment for Democracy, which is the leading human rights democracy organization based in Washington, D.C. Congress appropriated funding for this. There were offshoots of the National Endowment for Democracy, the National Democratic Institute, the International Republican Institute, the Solidarity Center, and CIPE, the Center for International Private Enterprise. All four of those, together with the NED as the overarching entity, became vital instruments and vehicles by which we would support democracy and human rights in various parts of the world. The president's speech in Westminster also led in response to domestic uprising in the Philippines to the efforts to take Ferdinand Marcos and his wife out of the Philippines and to let the Philippines have an opportunity to move in a more democratic direction. South Korea has been mentioned before, another example. And then, of course, I mentioned the fall of the Berlin Wall. And this happened under President George H.W. Bush. But it also led to an opportunity to try to support democratic movements in countries of the former Soviet Union as they broke up and became independent. We had a tendency, however, in the 90s to prematurely label countries as democracies because they were moving from a communist system to something else that wasn't quite clear. They were holding elections, it appeared. They were talking about rule of law. But in reality, I think we jumped the gun. And the problem with this was, in the case of Russia, the 1990s were a period of tremendous dislocation. Very difficult times for many Russians who lost their life savings to the extent that they could accumulate them during the Soviet period. By describing that period as a democracy, we then ran the risk of undermining the notion of democracy to most Russians. To them, they felt, if this is democracy, I don't think I want any more of it. This has not been a good time. To many Russians, it was also the demise of what they viewed, given their Soviet upbringing, as a proud country. Soviet Union was no more. Russia, now half the population of what had been the Soviet Union. For countries like Ukraine, however, this was a tremendous opportunity. But for countries like Ukraine, they had to deal with the terrible legacy of the Soviet Union, where Ukraine and other parts of the former Soviet Union were treated abysmally. Corruption remained a huge problem. And so here, too, our efforts to support these countries in their independence needed to be tempered in our rhetoric, because it wasn't quite clear where some of these countries were going. And in some cases, particularly in, say, Central Asia, or the case of Belarus, or other countries like Azerbaijan, these countries have not moved in a democratic direction. They have remained authoritarian. And so we have to be very careful in terms of describing what is happening in these places. President George W. Bush, son of H.W., came in. Democracy, freedom agenda was not on his mind at the time. He was more domestically focused. And then, of course, 9/11 happened. And 9/11 changed the world. It certainly changed President Bush's approach to viewing the world. And he recognized the need to support democracy and human rights around the world, because he recognized that where there is repression of human rights, where there are non-state actors trying to exploit weak societies, that posed a threat to the United States. And so in President Bush's mind, it was the responsibility and the obligation of the United States and fellow democracies to support democracy and human rights movements elsewhere around the world. In his second inaugural address, January 20th, 2005, he made the following remarks. The survival of liberty in our land increasingly depends on the success of liberty in other lands. The best hope for peace in our world is the expansion of freedom in all of the world. So it is the policy of the United States to seek and support the growth of democratic movements and institutions in every nation and culture, with the ultimate goal of ending tyranny in our world. This is not primarily the task of arms. I'll come back to that in a minute, though we will defend ourselves and our friends by force of arms when necessary. Freedom, by its nature, must be chosen and defended by citizens and sustained by the rule of law and the protection of minorities. America will not impose our own style of government on the unwilling. Our goal instead is to help others find their own voice, attain their own freedom, and make their own way. Today, America speaks anew to the peoples of the world. All who live in tyranny and hopelessness can know the United States will not ignore your oppression or excuse your oppressors. When you stand for your liberty, we will stand with you. Now, having just read that, a lot of you might be wondering, well, yeah, but what about Afghanistan and Iraq? Keep in mind, the U.S. decision to go into Afghanistan was not to promote democracy. It was in response to the source of attacks on 9/11. But we also recognized that if we just went in and tried to deal with ISIS and Al-Qaeda rather, and Osama bin Laden, then we were going to leave Afghanistan in a total shambles. And so we quickly realized we had to help Afghanistan recover from being under Taliban rule, from being under the influence of Al-Qaeda, and we decided to do what we could to support Afghans in their move. And as a result, following Taliban rule, Afghan women and children in particular, girls, did much better until the Taliban returned to power in 2021. Iraq. We didn't go into Iraq to build democracy either. We went into Iraq because we thought, mistakenly it turned out, that Iraq under Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. Here too, following Secretary Colin Powell's offering of the Pottery Barn rule, you break it, you own it. We decided we couldn't just go in and remove Saddam Hussein, but we had to do what we can to support Iraq in its transition from being under Hussein's rule to something that resembled more of a democracy. And Iraq, I would argue, for all of its troubles and travails, and Kawa can discuss this much better than I can, is better today, particularly without Saddam Hussein in power, than it was 23 years ago. Soon, a year after President Bush's second inaugural speech, there were elections in the Palestinian territories where Hamas won the elections. This was a bit of a setback to the freedom agenda, but we should have recognized that sometimes in these various parts of the world, elections produce results we don't like. We have to live with that. We have to accept that. You could argue that elections held in the Palestinian territories was premature, that the people there weren't quite ready for it. But they happened, and we had to accept the results. And so there are times where our support for principles of democracy, elections, and other things lead to outcomes that aren't so favorable to the United States. That's what happens sometimes with democracies. So what do we do in terms of supporting democracy? The main point is to support indigenous forces that are looking to move their countries in a more democratic direction, with respect for human rights, rule of law, independent judiciary, independent legislature, a vibrant media, a strong civil society. These are all the common ingredients of a democracy. Again, not necessarily in the model of the United States. I wouldn't recommend other countries have our electoral college system. I wouldn't recommend necessarily other parts of our system. Each country is unique, and each country should pursue its own path to democracy. But those elements that I just outlined are the generally essential features of democracy. And it is important to have checks and balances in other parts of the government so that power is not concentrated into one person. It's important that we stay away when countries do hold elections from picking winners and losers. First of all, we're not very good at it. Secondly, if we advance somebody, that person doesn't win, then we're off to a bad start with the individual who did win. We should support the process and let the people in these countries decide whom they want to lead them. Palestinian elections is a good example of that. It's also important, I think, to expose the corrupt behavior of authoritarian regimes. A lot of people living under repression will not like the fact that a certain leader is benefiting and living off the high hog while that individual is barely making it through every day. This has been tried in Russia, by the way. Alexei Navalny, the former and late opposition leader, has still a foundation that exists that exposes Russian corruption. It has not generated the reaction that many would like to see, but it does expose corruption that is important for Russians to know about. The challenge, as we talked about yesterday with soft power, is to make sure Russians know what Navalny's foundation is producing. So how are we doing in support of democracy and human rights? The short answer is not well. Freedom House, an organization I used to run a dozen years ago, will be coming out with its latest annual report called Freedom in the World. How many of you are familiar with that? Yeah, it's a really good guide to follow what's happening in the world. I would bet you donuts to dollars that when they come out with a report next month, it will show a 20th consecutive year of decline in freedom around the world. I haven't been privy to what's coming out, but that's my pretty educated guess. This means that there are more countries around the world suffering a decline when it comes to political rights and civil liberties than there are countries that are gaining. This will be 20 years in a row that this decline has been happening. This is due to the rise of authoritarianism in a number of countries, the surge in particular of communist China, where these countries are better organized in many cases than we are. They learn from each other's playbook on various methods to sustain their control over their people. It also was a reflection of disunity among democracies. We are not terribly good at getting our act together. And sometimes we don't treat our allies very well. Think of some recent cases of that. And then there is also democratic backsliding, where we see leaders who are elected democratically come to power and then do their best to make sure they don't lose power in the next election. Hungary is a good example of that. Election's coming up there in April. We'll see what happens. Democracies also need to deliver. And when democracies don't deliver for their people, the Chinese, for example, will say, told you so, not a good system for you to follow. Look at what we have done. We deliver for our people. They don't deliver politically, that's for sure. It's also important that as a result of these challenges, we avoid the threats of populism, xenophobia, ultranationalism, nativism, protectionism, isolationism. Isolationism is something we should avoid at all costs, and that comes in the United States from both ends of the political parties. We need to approach our work in this space with humility, recognizing we are not perfect. That striving toward a more perfect union, that is us. That is who we are. But we have to recognize that we make mistakes. At the same time, we need to recognize there are people around the world who are looking to the United States and other democracies for support and help. It could be political support, it could be financial support, it could be other means of support. But we need to recognize, and we did this in the Bush administration, about things like Abu Ghraib, renditions, all of these things. I went to Beijing in May of 2008 for a resumption of the human rights dialogue with the Chinese. And we started that dialogue by acknowledging our shortcomings. And as a result, after doing that at the beginning, the Chinese never raised those issues. Now, I won't pretend that we made any advances with the Chinese on their human rights problems, but we showed at least, I think, enough humility to recognize our own problems in the United States. Funding for this work has come under attack. The National Endowment for Democracy that I mentioned has received appropriations from the Congress. Just in the past few weeks, where President Trump signed the legislation, the appropriations for this work, unfortunately, I've heard that the Office of Management and Budget is trying to zero out that funding, even though it has been approved by Congress and signed by President Trump. Let me talk quickly about three cases, and then I'll wrap up. Venezuela. Great, spectacular mission by our military and intelligence services in removing Maduro. You may agree or disagree, you may argue it was a violation of international law. It's a good thing Maduro is gone. It is not such a good thing that we are now viewing Delcy Rodriguez, Maduro's vice president, as the next best thing. There is, for whatever reason, it may have something to do with the Nobel Peace Prize, that the administration doesn't view Maria Corina Machado as the likely next president if a free and fair election were held in Venezuela. Or Edmundo Gonzalez, who actually won the election a few years ago that Maduro stole. We are creating the impression that all we care about in Venezuela is oil. Your question earlier, ma'am. That's not a good look. not the reason we should have done what we did. Removing Maduro, we should recognize, gives Venezuela the first opportunity in many years to move in a more democratic direction. And I bet if elections were held in a free and fair fashion, that Delcy Rodriguez would not win. Iran. Incredibly inspiring images of Iranians braving tremendous threat to their own welfare, going out in the streets. And our president encouraged them to do so and said, we are locked and loaded and ready to back them up. We didn't do it. And there were, I think last night we were talking about the numbers. I think one of the best estimates is around 20,000 people were slaughtered by the Iranian regime just in the past month or so. And we didn't do anything. The talk now about possible military action against Iran and the regime is about the nuclear issue. Incredibly important. Don't mean to minimize it. But what the Iranian regime did to its own people is also important. And why is Iran a threat to us? Because of the way it treats its own people, which means they do the same to us if they could. And that's why it's important to support the Iranians, particularly if we encourage them to go out in the streets. And then we don't do anything. That's also not a good look. Lastly, I'll end with Ukraine. I would argue that Ukraine is the fight for freedom right now. Remember, the European continent was the source of 2 world wars in the last century. This is the worst security crisis on the European continent since World War II. The death toll is staggering. DSIS, a think tank in Washington, put out an estimate that 1.2 million Russians have been killed and wounded in this war that Putin started, by the way, not just 4 years ago, 12 years ago, when Putin decided to seize the Crimean Peninsula and move into the Donbass. More than 14,000 Ukrainians were killed between February of 2012 till February of 2022, when Putin launched the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Ukrainian President Zelensky recently told a French media outlet that he estimates 55,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed. UN estimates are that somewhere between 12 and 15,000 Ukrainian civilians have been killed. My bet is that figure is much, much higher. You look at the images of Russian drones and missiles deliberately, and these are war crimes, hitting hospitals, schools, apartment buildings. The toll that the Ukrainians put out, and I understand why, can't be close to the truth. This is the worst security crisis on the European continent for sure, I would argue right now in the world that we face. It is a test of NATO. It is a test of the United States. It is a test of democracies. It is a test of the West. And the Ukrainians, for sure, have responded to the challenge. Incredible what they have done against a vastly bigger military threat. Regained more than 50% of their territory, virtually destroyed the Russian Black Sea Fleet, even though Ukraine doesn't have a navy. Has been able to launch retaliatory strikes, and that word is key, retaliatory strikes, deep inside Russian territory against Russian energy facilities, because the Russians have been bombing Ukrainian energy facilities and power plants in the worst winter in many years, trying to force the Ukrainians into frozen submission. And the Ukrainians won't give in. Why? Because they're fighting for their land, for their freedom, for their lives. And so this war right now and our position matter enormously. I would argue it is our responsibility to help the Ukrainians. The Ukrainian government has never asked us to send our brave men and women to go fight this fight for them. They do need our military support. They do need our intelligence. And unfortunately, the current administration decided to end military assistance unless the Europeans purchase it from the United States. A pretty transactional approach that I think is not fair to the Ukrainians. So I would argue it is very much in US interest to support the cause of freedom around the world, can't be everywhere, but in Ukraine in particular. Because if we can help Ukraine defeat the authoritarian Russian threat, that is a huge setback, not just to Russia, it's a huge setback to this CRINC axis that poses a threat to us and every other democracy around the world. So let me stop there and happy to take your questions.
David, thank you so much. Questions, we have a couple of microphones on both sides of the aisle. If you have a question, please raise your hand. If students have any questions, let's start with some questions from students.
Thank you. Speaking on democratic backsliding, I wanted to know what your thoughts were on observations of democratic backsliding in the United States over the past year, and specifically how our effectiveness at promoting democracy is shaped by the strength of our own institutions.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not shocked you asked it. It doesn't help. It doesn't help. But again, it comes back to the point about humility that I made. We are facing challenges here. Challenges to court rulings, challenges to crack down on the press. You know all the issues. By the way, the Supreme Court just ruled earlier this morning against the tariff policy. We'll see what the reaction is to that. Despite our challenges and problems, I would argue, still have an obligation to help other countries, people in other countries who are trying to advance the cause of democracy and human rights, the cause of freedom. The current administration has a different view. I would say the Biden administration came in and said this was going to be a central part of its foreign policy, and then it really wasn't. I think it is, for all of our challenges and shortcomings, still important for us to stay very involved in this pursuit because it advances our interests at the end of the day. And that's the bottom line. We do this because it is in our interest. It helps other countries for sure. It helps people who, if they came to power, would undoubtedly be our allies. But we have a line of work at the Bush Institute that focuses on our democracy. You can imagine that's an unfinished piece of work. It is an area where our elections matter, and there's some challenges now to our elections. But we have been through difficult times before in this country. We had a civil war. President Bush points to 1968, a year when there were two major political assassinations of Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy, the Vietnam War protests, unrest on college campuses. We have gone through difficult times in our past. There's no automaticity to democratic development. It takes the commitment of people to ensure we stay on a democratic path. There's no button you can push to make sure we stay on that path. But there does seem to be a lot of people energized in our country to do their best to make sure we stay on that path. And so despite the challenges we face, I remain optimistic that we will get through this. I don't mean to sound Pollyanna about it, but there are plenty of people who are raising the alarm, and that's important to do. But also offering solutions on what needs to be done is important.
Somewhat touched on this when you talked about Hamas before, but I was wondering, if democracy votes itself into a non-democratic system, should the United States intervene, even if intervention is contrary to the will of the people?
No. In the case of Hamas, we didn't intervene. But it meant that the potential in relations between the United States and Palestinians was severely curtailed. We didn't want to have anything to do with Hamas. We designate Hamas as a terrorist organization. And there are consequences to elections, not just for us, but for people around the world. And so if Palestinians decided they wanted Hamas as their leaders, that would lead to a reaction from the United States, not a kinetic military reaction. It's also important that with these elections, if leaders come to power through a democratic election, to make sure they don't use their election victory as an opportunity to make sure that nobody replaces them. And this comes back to the corruption, authoritarianism connection that I was talking about. So we should, when elections are stolen, that's a different matter. Again, it doesn't trigger a military response from us, but it should be denial of recognition of legitimacy by the United States. Maduro stole the election in 24 in Venezuela. Alexander Lukashenko in Belarus stole the election in 2020 there. We shouldn't give legitimacy to those leaders by recognizing them as the presidents. We shouldn't give them a platform on the global stage. I don't think it was the smartest thing to invite Belarus or Russia or some other countries into the Board of Peace. Those are countries with regimes that are far from democratic. Lukashenko, by the way, in Belarus came to power through a democratic election in 1994. 1994. He's been in power for 32 years. He has used elections ever since to secure his grip on power by making sure elections are not free and fair, disqualifying candidates, killing them if necessary, imprisoning them. So this is an example where people who come to power through elections, if they're democratic, we should respect the process. We may not like the outcome, and that may have an impact on our relationship. But people who steal an election is where I think we should have not a military response, but a response where we don't offer legitimacy. Going back there. Sorry. Go ahead while he's getting a mic.
Thank you. You already answered one of my questions about Ukraine, but I was also wondering what were kind of the challenges that the U.S. is facing at the moment in Afghanistan trying to promote the women's rights?
Yeah, this is an issue also very near and dear to the hearts of President and Mrs. Bush. Mrs. Bush was chair of what had been known as the U.S. Afghan Women's Council, and that's something we're continuing at the Bush Institute because it was part of the State Department, which got terminated by the recent changes there. Since the Taliban's return to power in 2021, there have been denials of women's rights, girls' rights for education, for employment. And it's not just women, by the way. I mean, this is across the board. Afghans are suffering under the Taliban. Again, one of the more repressive regimes in the world. We are trying to provide a platform for Afghan voices. If you look at the Catalyst issue, I mentioned our online journal, there is an essay that came out yesterday from an Afghan refugee about what America means to her. And it's also important, and we have, we've exposed the corruption of the Afghan regime, the Taliban, in something we call the, I forget what it's called, but it's on our website, you'll find it. We also have a Taliban tracker that follows the travel of Taliban officials, even though they have been sanctioned. And there are countries that are aiding and abetting the Taliban, and they should be exposed for what they're doing. So we're trying to do those various things. Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you again for your comments and your kind of defense of democracy and human rights as a pillar of foreign policy. I think probably most of us who are engaged with global affairs, I think can clearly see why, or see the logic of the argument why democracy and human rights should be a pillar of national security and foreign policy broadly. I guess my question is more about the broader American public.
Yeah.
So my kind of understanding is, for most part, the global or broader national support of the freedom agenda was also closely tied to the global war on terror. And since the US has moved on from the global war on terror and that kind of approach to understanding global conflict, that the support for the freedom agenda, in the broader American public has also waned. And I wonder, what is the kind of argument we can make, now in this kind of changing world order of why democracy and human rights still matter for the American public broadly, not just for the US foreign policy establishment?
Yeah, no, that's great. Let me take China and Russia as the two best examples of why we need to counter their authoritarian influence and their efforts to undermine our democracy. So I'm approaching your answer a little more from the threat angle. The Chinese, if they were to control the semiconductor industry, and that's why Taiwan to them, in part, not only, but in part is so attractive to them. They don't like that Taiwan is a democracy either, but that would pose a major threat to the United States. to have the semiconductor industry under the control and influence of the Chinese Communist Party would pose a serious challenge to us. The Russians have interfered in our elections. They have launched cyber attacks against hospitals during our COVID pandemic. They are cutting cables under the sea that are critical for communications purposes. They assassinate people in other countries, including in the UK and Germany, elsewhere. They are involved in corruption, which means they export corruption. Arguably, Russia's greatest export is corruption. In order to export corruption, we also import corruption. So we need to do a better job of cleaning up our act and pressing for more transparency on real estate deals, business deals, all this sort of thing. Right now, there's a Russian, one of the interlocutors in the negotiation process, Kirill Dmitriev, who's head of their direct investment fund, who's talking about 14 trillion, with a T, $14 trillion in possible investment deals between Russia and the United States. Russia's GDP is $2 trillion. Russia is the richest country in the world in terms of natural resources. There's no way it's $14 trillion. But more importantly, it is gross and unseemly to me that US officials would be talking to Russian officials about potential business deals between our two countries at the same time that Russian missiles and drones are killing Ukrainians every single day. And so we need to do a better job of protecting against these kinds of threats and challenges. The Russians want us to forget Ukraine, they say. There's so much potential bilaterally between our two countries. And yet we have to remember they mean us harm. And so supporting democratic forces in these countries, including perhaps most importantly, Ukraine, is one of the best ways to counter the authoritarian threat that is a real challenge to our system. And when you hack into hospitals during a pandemic, that's not the act of a friendly nation. When you interfere in our elections, all of these things. And so if we want to be able one day maybe to reduce the military budget, the best way to do it is to support democracy. We are the richest, most powerful country in the world by far. And no one should take for granted any spending of taxpayer dollars on certain things. But we also are capable of fixing our roads, improving our schools, making sure people can eat in our country at the same time that we make a small investment in the scheme of things in support of democracy elsewhere around the world. So I strongly believe we are capable of doing both. I also believe we should do both because it is in our interest. So thank you for the question.